The carnival procession wound through Sao Paulo's Ibirapuera Cemetery on a humid afternoon in February 1978. Bright umbrellas dotted the landscape like scattered butterflies against the tropical haze. Mourners in white linen moved between palm-shaded graves, their faces marked with a particular sorrow reserved for comrades lost in shadow wars. The honor guard from the Brazilian naval attaché stood at rigid attention beside a freshly prepared tomb. A priest murmured prayers in Portuguese over an elaborate casket draped with the Brazilian flag. Every detail appeared legitimate, every element seemed genuine, every mourner displayed appropriate grief. But this funeral was the most sophisticated deception ever orchestrated by the Central Intelligence Agency.
The deceased never drew breath. The casket held only ballast. The ceremony was a mechanism engineered to neutralize one of the most devastating operatives in Soviet intelligence architecture. His code designation was Volkov, though even that label was manufactured fiction. For 17 years, this phantom had choreographed eliminations across Latin America, commanded networks that penetrated American military installations, and erased dozens of CIA personnel with clinical efficiency. He was accountable for operations that had cost American intelligence billions of dollars and immeasurable human capital. The agency had deployed every resource to pinpoint him. Surveillance assets had burned years pursuing mirages through Caracas, Buenos Aires, and Montevideo. Signals intelligence had produced nothing except phantom leads. Traditional human intelligence operations had imploded spectacularly, with 5 consecutive penetration attempts concluding in the execution of agency assets. But intelligence analysts had identified something extraordinary embedded in thousands of photographs, diplomatic cables, and surveillance documentation accumulated over the preceding decade. A pattern so subtle that recognition required years, so reliable that it offered the first legitimate opportunity to engage the man who had remained undetectable to Western intelligence for over a decade. Volkov attended funerals. Not arbitrary ceremonies, but specifically the burial rites of Soviet operatives who had expired during field operations. He manifested at these events invariably, perpetually masked, perpetually encircled by defensive layers, perpetually executing the same private ceremony at the graveside. The funerals constituted his only predictable behavior in an otherwise completely chaotic operational profile. The discovery had materialized from exhaustive analysis conducted by a team of CIA photo interpreters operating in a classified facility beneath Langley. They had been scrutinizing surveillance photographs from 19 different South American cities, searching for recurring individuals, patterns, connections that might reveal the infrastructure of Soviet intelligence operations. The breakthrough materialized when analyst Rebecca Torres noticed the same silhouette appearing in funeral photographs captured in Rio de Janeiro, Lima, and Bogotá over a 5-year period. The subject was perpetually transformed, different hair, different facial architecture, different clothing, different apparent nationality, but the kinesthetic signature was unchanging. The way he maintained his weight slightly forward on his left foot, the specific manner in which he approached the grave, always from the south side, always pausing for exactly 20 seconds, always placing a simple white rose on the casket with his right hand before withdrawing. The protocol never deviated regardless of disguise, regardless of location, regardless of the circumstances surrounding death. Cross-referencing these observations with intelligence documentation from the period revealed something remarkable. Every funeral where this figure materialized involved operatives who had functioned directly or indirectly for networks that intelligence sources attributed to Volkov. The funerals were not ceremonial obligations, they were operational briefings. Volkov was utilizing these ceremonies to evaluate allegiance among survivors, identify recruitment opportunities from among the attendees, and transmit classified verbal instructions that would never materialize in documented communications. The realization transformed American comprehension of Volkov's operational methodology. Beyond these funeral appearances, he operated from inside a fortified compound 40 kilometers north of Havana, surrounded by Cuban military forces, layered security checkpoints, and counter-surveillance systems that rendered any direct assault completely impossible. The compound featured interlocking defensive sectors, motion detection arrays, trained attack animals, and a security architecture that required visitors to navigate 11 separate authentication procedures before accessing the primary structure.
American reconnaissance had located the installation, but assessed it impenetrable without a full military invasion that would trigger immediate superpower confrontation. The funerals represented the only moments when Volkov emerged from the stronghold, the only instances when he was vulnerable, but even then the exposure was minimal. Soviet counterintelligence treated these ceremonies as sacred protocols, deploying watchers throughout the cemetery grounds, positioning sharpshooters on adjacent buildings, and establishing multiple exfiltration routes in case of compromise. Soviet security doctrine considered the funeral territory to be temporarily sovereign Soviet ground, protected with the same intensity as embassy compounds.
The CIA team assigned to develop a plan to exploit this opportunity confronted impossible constraints. They needed to manufacture conditions that would guarantee Volkov's attendance while providing an opportunity to eliminate him without triggering catastrophic retaliation from Moscow. The operation had to appear accidental or preferably like an internal Soviet malfunction that could not be attributed to American involvement. Any evidence of CIA participation would justify unlimited Soviet response, potentially including the assassination of senior American officials or the exposure of critical intelligence networks across 2 continents. The solution materialized during a planning session in September 1977. Rather than attempting to infiltrate or attack an existing funeral, the CIA would fabricate their own. They would engineer a completely manufactured ceremony so convincing that Soviet intelligence would treat it as authentic. They would construct every component of the event, from the death certificate to the burial authorization, creating a fictional Soviet operative whose death would demand Volkov's personal attendance. The fictional operative was designated Lieutenant Commander Alexei Petrov, assigned to a cover identity as a naval engineering consultant at the Soviet trade mission in Sao Paulo. According to the meticulously constructed background, Petrov had been running a network of Brazilian informants inside defense contractors when he was identified and eliminated by Brazilian counterintelligence. The circumstances of his death were engineered to activate specific protocols that would require investigation by Volkov personally. Creating a credible death required manipulating multiple bureaucratic systems simultaneously. CIA assets inside the Brazilian government filed legitimate death certificates listing Petrov as a victim of a boating accident. Fabricated medical reports described injuries consistent with drowning and propeller trauma. Planted witnesses provided statements to Brazilian authorities describing a maritime incident that had never occurred. The documentation flowed through official channels, establishing a paper trail that would satisfy even paranoid Soviet verification procedures. The Soviet mission received notification of Petrov's death through standard diplomatic channels. Brazilian officials expressed appropriate condolences and offered assistance with repatriation of the remains. But the CIA had calculated that certain details of the case would prevent immediate repatriation and force the Soviets to conduct the funeral in Sao Paulo. The manufactured evidence suggested that Petrov had been transporting classified materials when he died, materials that Brazilian authorities were still analyzing.
Soviet protocol required that such cases be handled locally to avoid international incidents. More importantly, the evidence suggested that Petrov's network had been compromised before his death. 4 of his supposed Brazilian informants had disappeared in the weeks preceding the accident. Their disappearance implied either betrayal from within Soviet ranks or catastrophic operational security failures. Either possibility would demand personal investigation by the man responsible for all Soviet networks in the region. The CIA allowed Soviet intelligence to discover this information through carefully orchestrated leaks. Brazilian officials mentioned the missing informants during routine diplomatic conversations. Intercepted communications between Brazilian security services discussed the ongoing investigation into Petrov's activities. The Soviet Rezidentura in Sao Paulo initiated its own investigation, uncovering exactly what American intelligence wanted them to find. Within 1 week, Moscow had dispatched a special investigative team to Brazil. Within 2 weeks, arrangements were being made for a local funeral with appropriate military honors. The ceremony would be conducted according to standard Soviet protocols for fallen operatives killed in operational circumstances. The burial would take place at Ibirapuera Cemetery, where several other Soviet personnel had been interred over the previous decade.
What the Soviets did not know was that every aspect of the funeral had been anticipated, planned, and prepared by American intelligence. CIA operatives had spent months studying the cemetery's architecture, identifying optimal positions for concealed weapons, mapping sight lines, and determining exactly where Volkov would stand during his ritual approach to the grave. The casket itself had been specially modified by agency technicians operating in a Sao Paulo safe house. The elaborate wooden casket appeared identical to those used in previous Soviet funerals, but concealed within the decorative brass fittings was a precisely calibrated explosive device designed to detonate only when someone approached from the south side and placed a white rose on the casket lid. The timing mechanism was set to activate during the 20-second window when Volkov would be performing his ritual oblation, ensuring that the explosion would appear to be either an accident or sabotage by unknown parties. On the afternoon of February 14, 1978, as mourners gathered around the tomb and the priest began his prayers, Volkov arrived exactly as predicted. He wore the disguise of a middle-aged Portuguese businessman, complete with tailored suit and sunglasses, but his approach to the grave followed the identical pattern that CIA analysts had documented in 19 previous photographs. He stepped forward from the south side. He paused for exactly 20 seconds. He extended his right hand, holding a single white rose toward the casket.
And in that moment, 17 years of Soviet intelligence operations across Latin America came to an explosive conclusion. The explosion shattered the afternoon heat with a thunderclap that sent birds erupting from cemetery trees. The shock wave knocked mourners to the earth, their bright umbrellas spinning through the air like broken pinwheels. Windows shattered in buildings 4 blocks away. The elaborate casket disintegrated in a sphere of fire and twisted metal that left nothing but a smoking crater where Volkov had been standing. But the man who died in that explosion was not Volkov. In the pandemonium that followed, as Brazilian emergency services converged on the scene and Soviet security personnel shouted commands in Russian, a groundskeeper in work clothes calmly walked toward the cemetery maintenance entrance. His work boots crunched over shattered glass and scattered debris. His face remained concealed beneath a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. He moved with the unhurried pace of someone who belonged exactly where he was. The groundskeeper was Volkov, the authentic Volkov. The man who had been vaporized by the explosion was Colonel Sergei Andropov, Volkov's most trusted deputy and the only individual in Soviet intelligence who knew every nuance of his superior's operational methods. Andropov had attended the funeral in Volkov's place, performing the same ritual approach to the grave, following the same precise movements that CIA analysts had documented across 19 different ceremonies. The substitution had occurred 60 minutes before the funeral commenced. Volkov had arrived at the cemetery disguised as a Brazilian groundskeeper, carrying authentic employment credentials that identified him as João da Silva, a man who had worked at Ibirapuera for 12 years. The real da Silva was dead, eliminated 5 months earlier in a traffic accident that Soviet intelligence had arranged specifically to create this identity. Volkov had been preparing for this moment since the CIA's first attempt to locate him in 1967. He had known about the fabricated funeral from the beginning. Soviet counterintelligence had identified the manufactured death of Lieutenant Commander Alexei Petrov within hours of the initial Brazilian police report. The forged documents were competent but not flawless. The manufactured witness statements contained subtle inconsistencies that trained investigators could detect. The supposed mission records showed gaps that would never exist in genuine Soviet personnel files. But instead of exposing the American operation, Volkov had chosen to weaponize it against his adversaries. He had allowed his networks to discover the evidence that CIA operatives wanted them to find. He had permitted Moscow to authorize the funeral arrangements. He had even encouraged the deployment of standard security protocols that would make the ceremony appear legitimate to American observers.
The trap had been engineered to ensnare the trappers. Volkov had spent weeks identifying every CIA operative involved in the operation. His surveillance teams had photographed agency technicians modifying the casket in their São Paulo safe house. Electronic intercepts had captured communications between American handlers and their Brazilian assets. Counter-surveillance had mapped every escape route the CIA had prepared for their operatives. When the explosion occurred, 15 American intelligence officers died alongside Colonel Andropov. The blast had been calculated to eliminate not just the intended target, but every CIA operative positioned within the kill radius. The modified casket had contained enough explosives to level an entire city block, far exceeding what would be necessary to kill a single man. Among the dead was Rebecca Torres, the photo analyst whose pattern recognition had first identified Volkov's funeral attendants. She had been positioned near the grave disguised as a Brazilian journalist, close enough to confirm the target's identity before the strike. Her body was found 45 meters from the explosion site, killed instantly by shrapnel that had torn through her torso. Also eliminated was Marcus Webb, the CIA station chief in São Paulo, who had orchestrated the entire operation. Webb had been observing from a position behind a large mausoleum, equipped with radio communications to coordinate the timing of the attack. The blast wave had thrown him against a concrete structure with enough force to snap his spine. The CIA's most experienced surveillance specialist, Catherine Reynolds, had been watching from the cemetery's administration building through high-powered optics. The explosion had sent a piece of the casket's brass framework through the window where she was positioned, severing her carotid artery. She bled to death in 70 seconds. Each death had been precisely calculated. Volkov's intelligence networks had identified every American operative involved in the mission and determined exactly where they would position themselves during the funeral. The explosive device had been designed to create a specific pattern of destruction that would eliminate all CIA personnel, while appearing to be either an accident or evidence of internal Soviet betrayal. The official investigation concluded that Colonel Andropov had been killed by a bomb planted by anti-communist Brazilian militants seeking revenge for Soviet operations in their country. The explosive device was traced to materials stolen from a São Paulo construction site. Witnesses reported seeing suspicious individuals near the cemetery in the days preceding the funeral. Brazilian authorities arrested 5 men with right-wing paramilitary connections who confessed under interrogation to planning the attack.
The confessions were fabricated. The arrested men were Soviet agents who had volunteered for the mission, knowing they would be executed to maintain the deception. Their deaths provided perfect cover for the real architects of the operation, eliminating any possibility that the truth would emerge through conventional investigation. Moscow expressed outrage at the security failure that had allowed terrorists to penetrate a sacred ceremony. They demanded increased cooperation from Brazilian authorities in hunting down additional conspirators. They relocated Colonel Andropov's family to a comfortable apartment outside Moscow and awarded him posthumous decorations for his service to the motherland. The CIA's response was necessarily muted. They could not acknowledge the loss of 15 operatives without admitting to conducting illegal operations on Brazilian soil. The deaths were classified as training accidents, equipment failures, and medical emergencies. Families received standard notifications about classified missions that had encountered unexpected difficulties. The truth about São Paulo remained buried in files that would stay secret for the next 40 years. Volkov continued his work with enhanced security and unlimited resources. The successful elimination of an entire CIA operations cell had elevated his status within Soviet intelligence to mythical levels. He was promoted to Deputy Director of Foreign Operations and given command of networks spanning 6 continents. For the next 14 years, until his natural death in 1992, no Western intelligence service succeeded in identifying his true location or penetrating his operations. The man who had turned an American trap into a devastating counterattack became the most feared operative in Soviet history, responsible for eliminating over 250 Western agents and compromising intelligence networks across 4 decades. The fabricated funeral at Ibirapuera Cemetery achieved its objective perfectly. It had indeed eliminated a mastermind of Soviet intelligence operations. But the mastermind who died that humid February afternoon was not the one the CIA had intended to kill. Volkov had orchestrated his own death so completely that even his enemies believed he was gone. The groundskeeper who walked away from the explosion disappeared into Sao Paulo's crowded streets.
His true identity protected by papers that would satisfy any inspection. Behind him, emergency crews worked to identify bodies and collect evidence from what appeared to be a terrorist attack on a Soviet funeral. None of them realized they were cleaning up the aftermath of the most successful counterintelligence operation in Cold War history. The funeral had been fabricated, but the deaths were absolutely real. And the man who had planned it all was already preparing his next move against an enemy that still believed they had won. The investigation into the Ibirapuera cemetery explosion would have ended there, filed away as another Cold War tragedy, if not for a single photograph discovered in the rubble 40 years later during cemetery renovations. The image, found in the shattered remains of what had been the administration building, showed something that changed everything Western intelligence believed about that February afternoon. In the photograph, taken moments before the explosion by an automatic security camera, a figure in groundskeeper's clothing could be seen near the maintenance entrance. The image was grainy, damaged by decades of moisture and tropical decay, but facial recognition software in 2018 was sophisticated enough to identify the man with 92% certainty. The groundskeeper was not Volkov. The groundskeeper was CIA operative Daniel Forrester, a deep cover specialist who had been presumed killed in the explosion along with his 14 colleagues. The revelation triggered an immediate review of classified files that had been sealed since 1978. What investigators discovered rewrote the entire narrative of Operation Carnival as the Sao Paulo mission had been designated in CIA archives. The real Volkov had never attended funerals. The pattern that analyst Rebecca Torres had identified in those classified offices at Langley was not evidence of a Soviet mastermind's predictable behavior. It was evidence of the most sophisticated disinformation campaign ever conducted against American intelligence. For 5 years prior to the Sao Paulo operation, Soviet intelligence had been systematically feeding false information to CIA sources across Latin America. Planted documents suggested Volkov's funeral attendance. Manufactured surveillance reports showed the same disguised figure at cemetery ceremonies. Controlled agents provided testimony about witnessing the mysterious mourner who appeared at Soviet burial rites. Every piece of evidence that led the CIA to plan Operation Carnival had been deliberately crafted by Soviet counterintelligence under Volkov's direct supervision. The Americans had not discovered his weakness. They had fallen victim to an elaborate trap designed to eliminate an entire CIA operational cell in a single devastating strike.
The funeral itself had been genuine from the Soviet perspective. Lieutenant Commander Alexei Petrov was a real Soviet operative who had been executed by his own service after investigators determined he was providing intelligence to the Americans. His death had been orchestrated to create the exact circumstances that would trigger CIA interest and prompt them to mount the operation Volkov had been preparing to counter for over 3 years. Colonel Sergei Andropov, the man who died in the explosion, had volunteered for the mission knowing he would not survive. He had approached the grave performing the ritual that Soviet intelligence knew CIA analysts expected to see. His death was intended to provide perfect cover for the elimination of American operatives while appearing to be either an accident or evidence of internal Soviet betrayal. But Daniel Forrester had survived because he had recognized the trap moments before the explosion. His position near the maintenance entrance had been chosen specifically because it offered the best escape route if the operation went catastrophically wrong. When he noticed discrepancies in the behavior of supposed Soviet watchers around the cemetery, when he realized that too many details of the funeral were proceeding exactly as CIA planners had predicted, he had begun moving toward the exit. The explosion occurred as he reached the maintenance gate. The blast wave knocked him unconscious and buried him under debris, but the administration building shielded him from the worst of the destruction. When he regained consciousness hours later, Brazilian rescue workers had already declared the site clear of survivors. Forrester had remained hidden until nightfall, then escaped Sao Paulo using emergency protocols. His survival had been kept secret for 40 years because CIA leadership realized that acknowledging any survivor would raise questions about what had really happened at Ibirapuera Cemetery. If Forrester had witnessed evidence that the operation was compromised,
If he had seen indications that the Americans were walking into a trap, then the entire Sao Paulo disaster would be revealed as a catastrophic intelligence failure rather than an unfortunate accident. The truth was far worse than anyone had imagined. Volkov had not simply turned an American operation against its creators. He had orchestrated the entire sequence of events from the beginning, manipulating CIA intelligence gathering for years to create the exact conditions that would prompt Operation Carnival. The 15 American operatives who died in Sao Paulo had been deliberately sacrificed by their own leadership, who had ignored warning signs and proceeded with an operation based on intelligence they should have recognized as too convenient to be authentic.
The fabricated funeral had indeed been used to eliminate a mastermind, but the mastermind who died was American operational capability in Latin America. Volkov continued his work until 1992 when he died peacefully in his sleep at a Moscow hospital. His obituary made no mention of intelligence work, describing him simply as a decorated veteran who had served his country with distinction. The funeral was private, attended only by family members and close associates. No Western intelligence operatives were present. No surveillance teams monitored the ceremony. No photographs were taken. After Sao Paulo, no American agency ever again attempted to locate or eliminate the man who had demonstrated that the hunters could become the hunted with devastating efficiency. The groundskeeper who walked away from Ibirapuera Cemetery had accomplished something unprecedented in Cold War intelligence operations. He had used a fabricated funeral not just to eliminate enemies, but to completely destroy their operational capabilities while convincing them they had been victims of their own success. The explosion that shattered the February afternoon in 1978 marked the moment when Soviet intelligence proved that the most effective assassinations are the ones where the targets eliminate themselves. Volkov had given the CIA exactly what they thought they wanted, then watched as they walked willingly into their own destruction. The Ibirapuera Cemetery operation stands as perhaps the most chilling demonstration of how intelligence warfare actually functions in the shadows between superpowers. This was not a story of American ingenuity triumphing over Soviet paranoia. This was a masterclass in how the most dangerous adversaries are those who understand your methods better than you understand theirs. Volkov had achieved something that no intelligence operative before or since has managed to replicate. He had weaponized his enemy's own capabilities against them, turning American analytical brilliance into American destruction. The CIA had believed they were hunting a predator when in reality they had been carefully guided into becoming prey. The fabricated funeral succeeded completely in its objective. The mastermind was indeed eliminated that humid February afternoon, but the mastermind who died was not Soviet. The explosion that shattered the silence at Ibirapuera Cemetery marked the moment when 15 of America's most experienced intelligence operatives were erased from the Cold War chessboard in a single perfectly orchestrated move. The groundskeeper who disappeared into Sao Paulo's streets had demonstrated that, in the world of espionage, the most effective assassinations are often the ones where the targets eliminate themselves. The CIA had planned, funded, and executed their own destruction, believing until the very last second that they were achieving a historic victory against their most elusive enemy. Volkov had used a fabricated funeral to assassinate not just individual agents, but an entire operational capability. And the most terrifying part was that for 40 years, the Americans never even realized that they had been murdered.